Somewhere in a heated design studio in Michigan, a group of General Motors stylists looked at photographs of a brand new Chrysler and felt something close to panic. What they were looking at didn't look like a Chrysler at all. It looked like the future. And the car they had just spent years perfecting, a car that hadn't even reached dealer lots yet, suddenly looked like it belonged to yesterday. So they did something almost unheard of in the automotive business. They threw it away. Not the whole car. Just its future. The car you're about to learn about, the 1958 Chevrolet Impala, was born with an expiration date nobody announced out loud. And it came from a boardroom decision made in response to fear. This is the story of a car that shared no sheet metal with the model that came before it, and no sheet metal with the model that came after it. A true one-year-only design in an era when Detroit almost never did that. And by the end, you'll understand exactly why a car this good, this important, and this influential got exactly 12 months to exist before it was erased. This is Legacy Engines, and I spend way too much time thinking about why the greatest cars in American history only got one shot to exist. If you're someone who loses sleep over one-year-only designs, forgotten engineering gambles, and the decisions that quietly shaped the cars we all grew up loving, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. But before we get into the full story, real quick, drop a comment right now telling us which classic car you want us to cover next. The comment with the most likes becomes our next video. Okay, let's get into it. To understand why the 1958 Impala only lasted a year, you first have to understand what Chevrolet was in 1957. Chevrolet was the value brand. The car for the working family. Reliable, affordable, and thoroughly unglamorous. That reputation had made Chevrolet the best-selling automaker in America for years. But it also meant Chevrolet was leaving money on the table. There was a growing middle class in post-war America with more disposable income than ever before, and those buyers wanted something a step above basic transportation without paying Cadillac or Buick money for it. Ford saw the same gap in the market and responded by launching an entirely new brand to fill it. A brand called Edsel. Chevrolet's answer was smaller in scope, but as it turned out, far more successful. Instead of inventing a new nameplate from scratch, Chevrolet planners decided to create a new top-tier trim level that would sit above their existing flagship, the Bel Air, without requiring an entirely separate dealer network or marketing campaign. It was a lower-risk bet than what Ford was making. And it paid off in ways nobody at Chevrolet fully predicted at the time. Here's something almost nobody knows about this car. It very nearly wasn't called Impala at all. Early on, planners were kicking around the name Bel Air Executive, a fairly dry, corporate-sounding label for what was supposed to be Chevrolet's most upscale offering yet. When the name Impala was eventually proposed instead, borrowed from an African antelope known for its speed and grace, it did not land well with everyone in the room. Chevrolet's own general manager reportedly wasn't impressed, dismissing it as little more than the name of a goat-like animal. It's a strange thing to imagine now, given that Impala would go on to become one of the most recognized nameplates in American automotive history, eventually running for over 60 years and selling in the tens of millions. But in that room in the mid-1950s, it was just another name on a list. And not everyone's favorite. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so they picked a name and moved on. What's the big deal? Here's the thing. The name fight was actually a symptom of a much larger tension inside Chevrolet at the time. There were people inside that company who genuinely believed that a premium Chevrolet was a contradiction in terms. That the whole point of the brand was affordability, and that chasing prestige buyers would confuse the customer base and dilute the brand's identity. Those people weren't wrong, exactly. They were just looking at 1955 when they should have been looking at 1965. So where did the actual look of the car come from? This is where it gets really interesting, because the 1958 Impala wasn't designed in a vacuum. It was the production echo of two show cars that had toured the Motorama circuit years earlier. The first was a 1955 concept called the Biscayne. A four-door hardtop with a toothy grille, bug-eyed headlight treatment, rounded pontoon fenders, and a scalloped body side that flowed into a flat rear deck lid. If you study photographs of that concept next to the production Impala's roofline, the resemblance is unmistakable. The second influence came a year later in 1956 with a concept literally named the Corvette Impala. This was a two-door take on that same general roofline, and it's actually where the Impala name first appeared publicly. 2 full years before the production car would carry it into showrooms. That concept wore an oval grille, which never made it to production because Chevrolet's engineers decided a combined bumper and grille arrangement would be far cheaper to manufacture. The Corvette Impala concept also hinted at fin shapes along the rear, though nothing as sharply canted as what would eventually appear on the finished 1958 car. The styling didn't stop with GM's own concept cars, either. Look closely at the side molding running down the flanks of a 1958 Impala, and you're looking at a design lineage that traces back to a 1954 Fiat Coupe styled by the Italian house Ghia. There's also a persistent rumor, never definitively confirmed but widely repeated among collectors, that the strange non-functional scoop mounted above the rear window took some visual inspiration from the Mercedes-Benz 300 SL Gullwing, a car that was turning heads across Europe at the time. And that scoop deserves its own story, because it's one of the more fascinating footnotes in the entire car's development. Here's what most people don't realize about that roof vent. It wasn't supposed to be fake. GM's engineers originally designed it to be fully functional, an air extractor meant to pull stale cabin air out through the rear of the roofline as the car moved down the road, keeping the interior fresher without cranking a window down. It's a clever idea on paper. In wind tunnel and road testing, though, engineers discovered something they hadn't anticipated. The spot where they'd placed the vent sat in a low-pressure zone at speed, which meant instead of sucking air out of the cabin, it was actually pulling outside air in. The exact opposite of what it was designed to do. Rather than redesign the vent's placement and risk delaying production, GM simply made it decorative. A sculpted shape with no actual function, purely there to look fast and aerodynamic. And here's the twist. That trick became something of a GM signature over the following decade. The 1963 Corvette rolled out with fake hood grills and fake air extractors, purely for looks. The 1963 through 1965 Buick Riviera carried a rear trim piece designed to mimic an air extractor that did nothing at all. It wasn't until 1971 that GM's full-size cars actually got a genuinely functional deck lid air extractor. And even then, by most accounts, it didn't work particularly well either. Sometimes the fake version and the real version ended up performing about the same. Now, let's talk about what actually separated an Impala from a lesser 1958 Chevrolet. Because up front they shared plenty. The grille, the hood, most of the underhood mechanical layout. But move toward the back of the car and the Impala diverged sharply from its cheaper siblings. It had its own distinct roofline and unique rear half-sheet metal. It had aluminum-trimmed door panels and striped upholstery inside, details the lesser trim levels didn't get. There was a chrome trim piece mounted ahead of the rear wheels that collectors nicknamed the pitchfork. A small but unmistakable visual marker separating an Impala from a base Bel Air at a glance. And then there was the feature that would go on to define the nameplate for decades afterward. A triple tail light cluster on each side of the rear end. 6 lights total, arranged in a way no other Chevrolet wore that year. This detail became so central to Impala's identity that Chevrolet kept bringing it back for generations. It showed up again through the 1960s, and remarkably it resurfaced even on cars that weren't flagship models at all, appearing on the front-wheel drive Chevrolet Lumina in the early 1990s. More than 3 decades after the original Impala debuted. A styling detail born out of a one-year-only car ended up outliving that car by generations. Think about that for a second. The body was gone in 12 months. The tail lights lasted 30 years. Underneath all of that styling sat something far more consequential than trim pieces and tail light. The 1958 Chevrolet lineup, Impala included, rode on a completely new chassis. Every Chevrolet before 1958 used what's called a perimeter frame, a fairly conventional structural layout that had served the brand for years. For 1958, engineers threw that out and introduced something new. An X-shaped frame, sometimes marketed as a safety girder design, built around a central tube with the rails converging toward the middle of the car rather than running in parallel down each side. This wasn't a cosmetic update. It was a fundamental engineering shift, and it existed for a specific reason. By narrowing the frame rails toward the center, GM's engineers could drop the passenger compartment significantly lower without sacrificing interior space, which let the entire 1958 lineup achieve that longer, lower, wider look that dominated American car advertising in the late 1950s. The wheelbase grew from Chevrolet's traditional 115 inches out to 117.5 inches. Overall length stretched past 209 inches. Height dropped by nearly 4 inches in some models. All of that came with a cost, though. The new car ended up roughly 150 to 200 pounds heavier than the 1957 models it replaced. A fact that seems almost quaint by modern standards but mattered quite a bit to engineers chasing performance numbers in an era before computer-aided design made weight optimization easier. The suspension underneath that new frame changed just as dramatically. Chevrolet dropped the leaf springs that had handled rear suspension duty for years and moved to coil springs at all four corners with a 3-link control arm setup at the rear. Marketed under a ride quality tagline, the standard coil setup was a genuine improvement in comfort over what had come before. But Chevrolet also offered something far more ambitious as an option. A true four-wheel air suspension system that replaced the coil springs entirely with rubber bellows at each corner, fed by an engine-driven compressor. In theory, this system would self-level the car regardless of passenger or cargo load, reduce nosedive underbraking, and automatically adapt to changing road conditions. It sounds remarkably similar to air suspension systems that eventually became common on luxury vehicles decades later. And in fact, this same general concept would show up again on Lincoln's air-suspended cars of the 1980s and 1990s. But in 1958, the materials and manufacturing tolerances needed to make it reliable simply didn't exist yet. The system leaked. The compressor sapped a meaningful chunk of engine power just running it, and it delivered far less of a noticeable ride improvement than the marketing promised. GM ended up recalling many of these units, swapping them out for conventional coil suspensions and refunding customers who'd paid extra for a feature that mostly just caused headache. Because of that recall, genuine surviving 1958 Impalas with their original air suspension system still intact are exceptionally rare today. Collectors who find one know immediately they're looking at something unusual. Here's what most people don't realize about that air suspension situation. It wasn't an isolated stumble. It was part of a broader pattern running all the way through this car's development. Chevrolet in 1958 was simultaneously reaching for genuinely ambitious engineering ideas while also trying to hit aggressive production timelines and cost target. And again throughout this car's story, the ambitious idea ran headfirst into the reality of what 1950s manufacturing could actually deliver reliably and affordably at scale. The simpler, more conservative solution kept winning. Not always because it was the better idea in the abstract, but because it was the one that actually worked when you were building hundreds of thousands of cars a year. Now let's talk about the engine. Because underneath that new frame and suspension sat something that mattered even more to Chevrolet's long-term reputation than any styling cue or suspension choice. The base engine in a 1958 Impala was still a 235 cubic inch inline-six, nicknamed the Blue Flame, producing a modest 145 horsepower. Most buyers who wanted more performance stepped up to the 283 cubic inch V8, available in a wide spread of states of tune, from a mild 185 horsepower version all the way up to a fuel-injected ramjet variant pushing close to 250 horsepower. That was remarkably advanced technology for a mainstream American car at the time. But the engine that mattered most for Chevrolet's future wasn't either of those. It was an entirely new 348 cubic inch V8, marketed as the turbo thrust. In its base 4-barrel carburetor form, it made around 250 horsepower. Step up to the tri-power configuration, 3 2-barrel carburetors feeding that same block, and output climbed as high as roughly 315 horsepower depending on the exact specification. This engine mattered for one simple reason. It was the direct ancestor of the 348's most famous descendant, the 409 cubic inch V8 that Chevrolet would introduce just a few years later in 1961. An engine so celebrated it eventually got its own hit song. Every muscle car enthusiast who ever chased a 409 owes something to the engineering work done under the hood of this one-year-only 1958 Impala. There's a small detail buried in that engine bay worth pausing on. The power steering pump on a 1958 Impala ran off the same pulley and belt as the generator, an unusual packaging choice rarely repeated on other GM vehicles from the era. It's the kind of thing only a restorer hunting original parts would ever notice. But it's a reminder of just how much engineering experimentation was packed into this single model year all at once. Nothing about this car was phoned in. Buyers choosing between all of those engine options also had a real decision to make about how power reached the road. A manual transmission was standard, but most Impala buyers stepped up to one of two automatic. The first was Powerglide, a simple 2-speed automatic that had been in Chevrolet's lineup for years and had earned a reputation as being genuinely dependable, tough, and easy to service. The second option was Turboglide, a more sophisticated design introduced the previous year. Turboglide promised smoother, more seamless shifts than Powerglide. But in practice, it developed a reputation for being fragile and expensive to repair when something went wrong inside it. Chevrolet would eventually discontinue Turboglide entirely by 1961, quietly conceding that the simpler, tougher Powerglide had been the better long-term bet all along. Look, there's a pattern here that keeps repeating. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Every place in this car where Chevrolet chose ambition over simplicity, air suspension over coil springs, Turboglide over Powerglide, fancy engineering over conventional solutions, they ended up retreating. And every time they leaned on something simpler and more proven, it lasted. That pattern doesn't make the 1958 Impala a failure. It makes it something far more interesting. It makes it a laboratory. A single model year where an entire engineering philosophy got field-tested at scale, with real buyers, in real driving conditions, all at once. It's also worth understanding just how significant that new X-frame chassis really was in the broader arc of automotive engineering, because it represented something of a transitional step between two worlds. Traditional body-on-frame construction, which Chevrolet and nearly every other American manufacturer had used for decades, kept the body and the frame as two separate, bolted-together structures. Fully unitized construction, where the body itself provides the structural strength with no separate frame at all, was the direction the entire industry would eventually move toward. The X-frame used on the 1958 Impala sat somewhere in between those two approaches. Chevrolet's engineers reinforced the rocker panels and firewall to work in partnership with that narrower X-shaped frame. An early hint at the kind of body-and-frame integration that would become standard practice on American cars decades later. There was a trade-off buried in that engineering decision, though. Because the X-frame lacked the continuous perimeter rail running along each side of the car that older designs had used, it offered noticeably less structural protection in a side-impact collision compared to a traditional perimeter frame. Safety standards and crash testing requirements in the late 1950s were nowhere near what they'd eventually become, so this trade-off didn't generate much public conversation at the time. But it's a detail engineers and historians point to today when explaining exactly why GM eventually moved away from the X-frame design in the years that followed. Now, you might be thinking that all of this engineering talk is interesting, but what was it actually like to sit inside one of these things? Behind the wheel, drivers gripped a two-spoke steering wheel with a perforated design collectors call the Swiss cheese wheel. A look meant to evoke the lightweight racing steering wheels of the period. It's a slightly ironic detail when you consider that the car wrapped around that wheel was actually heavier than the model it replaced. But it captured the sporting aspirations Chevrolet wanted the Impala name to represent. Inside, there was a sense of real occasion. The aluminum-trimmed door panels, the striped upholstery, the sweeping dashboard, all of it added up to something that genuinely felt like a step up, not just a badge pretending to be one. There's another layer to this story worth pausing on. Because the Impala wasn't actually its own standalone model in 1958 at all. It existed as a trim package layered on top of the existing Bel Air line. That meant a buyer walking into a Chevrolet dealership that year wasn't shopping for a car called Impala on a showroom sign. They were shopping for a Bel Air Impala, distinguished from a standard Bel Air by all of those details we've already covered. The triple tail lights, the pitchfork trim, the aluminum door panel accents. And crucially, in that first year, Chevrolet only offered the Impala package on two body styles. A two-door sport coupe hardtop and a convertible. There was no four-door Impala in 1958 at all. Something that seems almost strange to modern buyers who remember the Impala primarily as a family sedan for most of its later life. The convertible in particular carried real prestige. It ended up being the single most expensive model in Chevrolet's entire 1958 lineup. A genuine flagship moment for a brand that had spent decades being known mostly for its affordability rather than its prestige. Timing mattered here too. 1958 happened to be General Motors' 50th anniversary as a company. And there was clearly an appetite inside the corporation to make a statement with that year's lineup across every division, not just Chevrolet. Cadillac, Buick, Oldsmobile, and Pontiac all rolled out their own longer, lower, wider redesigns that same model year, each riding on a version of that new X-frame architecture. Seen in that light, the Impala wasn't an isolated experiment. It was Chevrolet's contribution to a company-wide push to celebrate half a century of existence by making every single division look more expensive and more modern than it had the year before. Think about the ambition of that for a second. 5 separate divisions, all redesigned at once, all riding on the same new frame, all aimed at looking more expensive and more dramatic than anything the company had built before. Here's what most people don't realize about that anniversary context. It actually increased the pressure on this car enormously. When you're building a statement model for your company's golden anniversary, there is no room to play it safe. Which explains why so many of the engineering decisions on this car went toward ambitious new ideas rather than proven solutions. Nobody was going to celebrate General Motors' 50th birthday with a car that looked like it had been cautiously engineered by a committee afraid of taking risk. They wanted drama. They got it. And then they paid for some of it. Given everything working against it, you'd expect the 1958 Impala to have struggled in the marketplace. The United States was in the middle of a real recession that year. Unemployment was pushing toward 8% historically. One of the worst economic environments imaginable to launch a new, more expensive model. And yet the Impala did the exact opposite of struggling. Chevrolet moved somewhere around 125,000 sport coupes and just under 56,000 convertibles in that first model year alone. Remarkable numbers for a brand new nameplate launched directly into a shrinking economy. The Impala alone accounted for a meaningful share of Chevrolet's total sales that year, and it helped push the brand back into its familiar position as America's best-selling automaker. A title Chevrolet had briefly lost ground on during the mid-1950s. Whatever else you want to say about the risks GM took with this car, the market answered clearly. People wanted it. So who actually built this thing? The 1958 Chevrolet lineup, Impala included, was one of the last major projects overseen by Harley Earl. The legendary design chief, who had run General Motors' styling operation since the 1920s and essentially invented the modern automotive design studio as an institution. Earl was nearing retirement by this point. Leadership of GM design was already transitioning to his eventual successor, Bill Mitchell, a man whose design philosophy would push GM in a noticeably sharper, more precise direction over the following decade. If Harley Earl represented the broad, sweeping, chrome-laden exuberance of 1950s American car design, Bill Mitchell was already thinking in straighter lines, cleaner edges, more purposeful shape. The handoff happened right here, with this car, at this exact moment. Day-to-day work on the Impala itself fell to Chevrolet's chief designer, Claire McKitchen, a man who had held that position since 1953 and had already led the celebrated Tri-5 Chevrolets of 1955, 1956, and 1957. McKitchen would go on to run Chevrolet's design studio through 1964 before an international transfer to GM's German subsidiary, Opel, where he helped create the Opel Diplomat Coupe, a car that carried unmistakable Chevrolet styling DNA into the European market. Later in his career, McKitchen worked on an ambitious GM initiative internally called the Task Program, short for Total Automotive System Concept. An early exploration of front-wheel drive architecture and interchangeable components that would eventually influence GM's X-Car platform, the underpinnings for cars like the Oldsmobile Omega, Buick Skylark, Pontiac Phoenix, and Chevrolet Citation in the decades that followed. Here's the thing about that detail. The man who designed one of Chevrolet's most beloved one-year-only body styles also helped lay groundwork for some of GM's most controversial cars of the 1980s. Automotive history is full of those strange chains of connection, where the celebrated and the criticized trace back to the same pair of hands. McKitchen is a perfect example of that. The 1958 Impala sits at one end of his career. The Citation sits somewhere near the other. They couldn't look more different. They share more DNA than you'd ever guess. Now let's talk about the real question. Why did this car only last a single year? The answer starts with fear. And it starts with Chrysler. Throughout 1957, Chrysler's entire product lineup was undergoing a dramatic transformation under design chief Virgil Exner, a movement the company marketed under the tagline Forward Look. These cars were lower, sharper, and more aggressively finned than anything else on American roads at the time. And when they hit showrooms, they made GM's existing lineup look conservative almost overnight. Not old, exactly, but cautious. And in 1957, cautious wasn't going to cut it. GM had already locked in its plans for the 1959 model year. Plans that would have kept the same basic engineering approach used on the 1958 cars, including this Impala. But when GM stylists and executives got a full look at what Chrysler had actually done, the reaction inside the design studios was close to panic. This is where it gets really interesting. Rather than risk showing up to the 1959 model year looking dated against Chrysler's radical new shapes, GM made the costly, almost unthinkable decision to scrap the existing 1959 plans entirely and rush out an all-new design from scratch. That new 1959 lineup shared significantly more sheet metal and structure across GM's different divisions than the 1958 cars had. A cost-saving move partly born out of the enormous expense of that last-minute redesign. The result was that the 1958 Impala's unique body, developed with its own distinct roofline, its own rear half sheet metal, and its own engineering identity, was permanently retired after just 12 months on the market, never to be repeated in that exact form again. The 1959 cars that replaced it kept the general concept of the X-frame chassis, but pushed the whole formula dramatically further. Lower, longer, wider still, with an even more stretched-out wheelbase. In fact, GM's full-size cars from 1959 through 1960 ended up with some of the lowest seating positions of any full-size American vehicle ever produced. Seats mounted almost directly on the floor just to preserve enough headroom given how dramatically the roofline had been dropped. That extreme seating position didn't last. Complaints about comfort and visibility led GM to raise seat height back up again, starting with the 1961 model year, quietly correcting course on a design decision that had gone a step too far in the pursuit of that dramatic low look. There's a real lesson buried in that correction. When you make design decisions out of fear of a competitor rather than from a clear-eyed understanding of what your customer actually needs, you often overshoot. Chrysler scared GM into going lower. GM went lower than anybody should reasonably sit in a car. And then they had to quietly walk it back. That's what panic-driven design looks like in the historical record. A 2-year detour that required its own correction. There's one more small detail worth knowing about this car's brief life. The cover of Chevrolet's 1958 sales brochure appears to have been photographed at the GM Technical Center in Warren, Michigan. And if you look closely at the background of that brochure image, you can spot the Alexander Calder sculpture that still stands today in front of the GM Design Building. A quiet piece of corporate history hiding in plain sight on a piece of vintage advertising material. Most people who owned this brochure back in 1958 never noticed it. Collectors who stumble across it today recognize it immediately. It's worth stepping back for a moment and comparing how differently this bet played out for Chevrolet compared to how it played out for Ford. Remember, both companies identified the exact same gap in the market at roughly the exact same time. Buyers who wanted more prestige than a base Chevrolet or base Ford but weren't ready to spend Cadillac or Lincoln money. Ford's answer was to build an entirely new brand around that idea, complete with its own dealer network, its own advertising campaign, its own identity, completely separate from the Ford name. Chevrolet's answer was far more conservative. A trim package layered onto an existing model sold through the same dealers who already sold every other Chevrolet, using a nameplate that some Chevrolet executives weren't even convinced was a good idea in the first place. History remembers how those two bets turned out, and the gap between them is enormous. Edsel became one of the most famous commercial failures in American automotive history, discontinued after just a few years, and its very name became a kind of shorthand in business schools and boardrooms for a product launch that fundamentally misjudged its audience. The Impala, meanwhile, launched into a recession on a body style engineered to last exactly one model year, and still managed to become one of the best-selling nameplates in the history of the American automobile. Lower risk, in this case, turned out to be the far smarter play. Not because caution is always right, but because Chevrolet understood what they were actually selling, which was an aspiration their existing customers already shared, not an entirely new identity those customers had never asked for. Now, you might be thinking, okay, great story, but does any of this actually matter today? Here's the thing. It matters enormously, because the decisions made in that one-year window in 1958 sent ripples forward through decades of American automotive history. The 348 engine became the 409. The 409 defined an era of muscle car performance. The X-frame chassis philosophy, for all its trade-offs, pushed the entire industry to think differently about how body structure and frame structure could work together rather than simply sitting bolted on top of each other. The triple tail light became a visual signature that outlasted the body it was born on by more than 30 years. The Impala nameplate itself ran through multiple generations, multiple reinventions, multiple near cancellations, all the way from 1958 to 2020. More than 6 decades of continuous production with roots going back to a name someone in a conference room almost rejected because it sounded like a goat. Here's what most people don't realize about one-year-only designs. They tend to become the most collectible examples of any nameplate precisely because they're isolated. A standard production run gives collectors multiple years of examples to choose from, which means values spread out and the rarest survivors become harder to identify. But a one-year-only body means every single genuine survivor is automatically rare. There's number 1957 or 1959 version of this specific body to dilute the pool. What you have is exactly what exists, no more, no less. And that scarcity, combined with the cultural weight of the Impala name, is exactly what makes an original 1958 Impala so valuable to serious collectors today. A genuine, well-preserved 1958 Impala convertible in strong original condition can command well into six figures at auction today. Not bad for a car that Chevrolet's own general manager once dismissed as being named after a goat. And that number isn't just nostalgia driving the price. It's scarcity, historical significance, engineering ambition, and the fact that this specific body style was never built again. You can't find a 1959 version of this shape because it doesn't exist. What survived is all there will ever be. There's something worth sitting with here. Because this car's story isn't really about a car. It's about what happens when an industry moves fast, when fear drives decisions, when ambition outruns manufacturing capability, when the thing you build to last gets replaced because someone across town scared you into changing direction. The 1958 Impala didn't fail. It sold well, it introduced technologies that shaped the decade that followed, it launched a nameplate that ran for 60-plus years, and it gave Chevrolet a story to tell about itself that went beyond cheap and reliable. It made Chevrolet aspirational in a way it had never quite been before. And then it was gone. 12 months. One model year. No announcement. No farewell edition. No limited run to mark the end of production. Chevrolet simply moved on to the next car, the way car companies have always moved on, because the product cycle doesn't stop and the competition never waits. The 1958 Impala got exactly one shot to make its mark. And here we are, more than 6 decades later, still talking about it. Sometimes the most memorable cars in automotive history aren't the ones that stuck around the longest. Sometimes they're the ones that got exactly one shot to make an impression and made it count. The 1958 Chevrolet Impala is proof of that. Born from fear, named after an animal somebody called a goat, launched into a recession, retired after 12 months, and worth 6 figures today. If that's not a legacy, nothing is.